Hello and welcome to our presentation today, the Affordances of Affordance Theory for Sustainable Design Pedagogy. My name's Dr. Alexandra Sherlock and I'm the Principal Researcher and Lead Author of this paper, and I'm representing this research on behalf of the research team who include my esteemed colleagues Dr. Tasia Iohannides and Penny Jagiello. I will attempt to talk through the key points of the paper, but please do refer to the full paper in the conference proceedings for more detail, including the literature review and full methodology. The paper is abridged, although probably not abridged enough. It does go very slightly over time, so we're looking at about 30 minutes. We very much appreciate your time to watch this presentation, and we hope that you find it worthwhile. So, as is customary with presentations from Australia, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university and on whose lands this research was conducted and this presentation was recorded. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So the focus of this research is the first activity, This Is Not a Shoe, in the course Fashion Design, Body, Artefacts and Accessories, which is an optional course within the Bachelor of Fashion Design at RMIT University. And it reflects this research reflects on the ongoing development of this activity, which uses fashion praxis to readdress the ways we do fashion in a sustainable context. Data for this research was collected over 2 semesters during 2020 and 2021 during COVID. So as you can see, a lot of this course has been conducted online using Miro workspaces, but also face-to-face. We are actually running the course presently. So with the exception of some of the contextual images, so there were 72 students in total, and with the exception of some of the contextual images included in this presentation, the data informing this paper represents the experiences of 27 of those students undertaking the activity last semester, so that's July 2021, 14 of whom agreed to be identified. Data was thematically analysed using NVivo. So through a theoretically driven approach to learning design, the This Is Not a Shoe activity encourages students to unmake a pair of used shoes and use the resulting components to inspire new accessory outcomes. In doing so, we join others introducing a methodological shift from conventional and often unsustainable design-led approaches to materials to a material-driven approach to design. In this context, and in line with established and evolving practices of upcycling, rather than sourcing materials to realise an accessory design, students are encouraged to utilise and collaborate with existing and available materials, often resulting in unexpected encounters, discoveries and design ideas. So the activity in the course within which it sits uses Gibson's affordance theory, or theory of affordances, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, in conjunction with practices of defamiliarization as a framework to effect this shift in design thinking and reflect on outcomes. In doing so, the activity goes beyond established methods for upcycling, which is a practice that's often criticised for its limitations for scaled reproduction, to explore the embodied and transferable capabilities and knowledges that may be enhanced through the practice of material reuse in an educational setting. So here we can see the aims of the activity and also the aims of the research. So the research team brings both theoretical and embodied practice-based perspectives to the development and delivery of the activity, and the research, design and interpretation of data, discussion of which explores the conditions necessary to perceive and utilise unconventional affordances and enhance a perception of matter, increasingly important in these digital times. And some of this terminology will become a little bit clearer as we go on. As you can see in the research aims, these data also present an opportunity to, as already mentioned, identify transferable capabilities and knowledges enhanced through material reuse, but also identify barriers and challenges faced when adopting a material-driven approach within design education. And the research actually goes a little bit further to propose specific methodological parameters that could enhance the meaningful, scalable and sustainable use or reuse of materials. So a bit more about the theoretical framework behind the activity design and the research. In 1979, ecological psychologist James Jerome Gibson wrote his seminal text, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, from which the theory of affordances has evolved. In an off-cited quote, Gibson defines the affordances of the environment to be what it offers the animal, or in this case human, what it provides or furnishes for either for good or ill. So according to Gibson, what we see when we look at objects or materials is not an objective set of features or values, but their affordances. People only perceive and notice elements of their environment that might provide or furnish them with something. And affordances therefore cut across the subjective-objective dichotomy. They are equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behaviour, in this case human behaviour. Used for its simplicity, his theory has been described as an elegant and practical tool by Davis recently in 2020 to counter persistent Cartesian perspectives in philosophy and cognitive science by relocating mental processes from inside the brain to in between mind and body, person and the surrounding environment. So from a design perspective, we might be thinking beyond the sketching of designs to the sketching and then realisation of designs through the use of materials to the realisation of design through interaction with materials. So Gibson's theory of affordances has been expanded. Most relevant to the current study is its use in the social sciences and humanities, where materials are understood to have agency. Materials become active collaborators in the creative process. Creativity is distributed between the designer and the material world rather than originating within the designer's head, as previously mentioned. And here we've put this image from the This Is Not a Shoe class deconstruction in 2020, a student struggling with one of the soles of the shoes, which would often resist intervention, really testing students and providing opportunity to expand their skills of resilience and resourcefulness. So Gibson's ideas have also been theorised in relation to creativity. Creativity is defined by Withagen and van der Kamp, and also Glavinot, as the unconventional use of an object's affordances, and accessible through interactions such as tinkering, experimenting and making, and that's Barati and Karana. So Fisher therefore clarifies that affordances cannot simply be built into or read out of artefacts, but are discovered by users through interaction with them. And so this process of making and discovery through material interaction is essential to the discovery of affordances. So perhaps less explored are the affordances of affordance theory for the education of sustainable design practice. And here it can be argued that choice abounds students in higher education, and because of this, Fry and Dilnot state that often students are educated in error. They are educated in defuturing actions, and this is something that I think we're all really reflecting on at the moment. And this is also compounded, we might argue, by the choice and availability of not only materials but also technology. So in this research we demonstrate that the denial of choice enables innovation, economical use of materials and forces a focus on considered sustainable over traditional design. A lack of abundance can therefore enable the emergence of unconventional affordances, thereby reinforcing the value of practices of material reuse in design education. And we're just showing a few more examples as we go through here from the This Is Not a Shoe activity. So, while the theorisation of affordances in relation to creativity and material-driven design gains momentum, according to Bharati and Khurana, there is currently no framework for the identification and discussion of the creative contribution of designers at design time. Furthermore, with the exception of Glavanow's important study of traditional egg decoration activities in rural Romania, there's a dearth of empirical research investigating the context in which designers and makers are able to perceive, generate, and utilise unconventional affordances. This is of particular interest from our own perspective as fashion design lecturers educating a digitally native and arguably largely materially illiterate generation of students. And we suggest that the field of fashion design is ideally situated to both benefit from and contribute to the evolution of affordance theory within design in an ecological context. And this is because fashion is both material and symbolic. And as Sampson argues in her recent book in 2022, the symbolic dematerialises things. The cultural dematerialisation of fashion perpetuates its environmental impact. So when put into practice, the theory of affordances can rematerialise fashion by helping to overcome conventional, unsustainable design practices and perceptions of materials. So while the use of Gibson's theory of affordances to evolve and understand creativity and material-driven design is not a new proposition, the contribution of the present research explores what these developments look like in the context of fashion, which is, as we've said, a symbolically potent form of materiality, and following Bharati and Khurana, how novel material potentials actually come about in practice. And I've drawn a little circle around the significance of the vans here. So this student hasn't just engaged with the materials, they've also engaged with the branding and thought about how that branding is useful to them in the construction of these new accessories. So why shoes? Shoes are culturally and socially symbolic to the extent they become invisible, as previously discussed. They comprise multiple materials, affording the development of diverse skills. Many materials are abject, they're sticky or dirty and ugly, presenting particular challenges. In many ways they're inconvenient, which is something that the students have to overcome. Their design and construction is often unsustainable and most cannot be recycled. So this actually provides students with an opportunity to consider what makes, or reflect on what makes unsustainable design, which often is discovered to be the use of adhesives. So through deconstruction, therefore, we're making strange or defamiliarizing these all too familiar objects. Bell et al. Argue that practices of making strange or defamiliarization are an important tool to enable designers to see beyond naturalizing devices and experiences, create space for critical reflection, open up new possibilities for design, and challenge or rethink existing design legacies or habits. Indeed, Glavanow explains that affordances are of little use if they're not perceivable to the user, and we propose that making matter visible requires a process of making strange. So an activity to unmake a pair of shoes is therefore helpful on numerous levels as a strategy to encourage fashion students to unlearn ways of knowing, see matter, perceive material affordances, and critique conventional and unsustainable uses of materials. And I love this example here of Mavsi's eyelet earrings constructed from Converse All-Star sneakers. So the learning design This activity is the first of 3 assessments. In the context of the 12-week course, the activity was designed to activate, as we've said, a perception of matter to be further developed through 2 further assignments, finishing with refined accessories or wearable artefacts. The materials used for these further assignments 2 and 3, were disposable household items and packaging. In a previous iteration of the course, it was also the leather offcuts from the shoemaking process, odd shapes and different qualities of leather, much of which, like the used shoes, these materials are conventionally perceived as unusable waste and rendered abject, ugly, insignificant, or even invisible. So for a fuller description of the learning design and delivery, please do have a look at the full paper. Fundamentally, though, students were encouraged to use the manual tools they had to hand, and in recognising the role of material agency in relation to affordances and material-driven design, they were encouraged by tutors to consider what interventions the shoes invited or permitted or indeed resisted. And this kind of language, along with questions such as what do the shoes want you to do with them, were used intentionally to nurture a sense of collaboration and communication with, rather than dominance over materials, and this acknowledgement of kind of material agency. So following deconstruction, a flat lay photograph of the component parts was taken before proceeding to a making phase, where they were asked to consider how the component parts might want to be reformed, joined, or adapted. Through interaction with the materials, students speculated on what these new forms might be used for, or where they might be placed on the body. Importantly, the assessment criteria discouraged, although at that stage did not ban, students from using virgin materials such as adhesives, embellishments, or jewellery findings, and required them to utilise as many of their materials as possible. Although again, that wasn't very strict in the assessment criteria, which is something that we'll come back to at the end. So to understand how unconventional affordances can be perceived, we must first identify commonly or conventional perceived affordances. So data was therefore analysed for the repeated selection and use of particular shoes, materials, techniques and strategies. So unlacing and unpicking were a common starting point, with the discovery that the removal of the sole made this process easier. Soles and adhesives were a frequent area of difficulty. Commonly identified affordances included laces and eyelets, used during reconstruction to connect, secure and create an adjustable fit, and heel counters and toe caps, identified for their capacity to cup, protect and emphasise parts of the body such as breasts, elbows, wrists, knees and shoulders. So the lacing and the cupping, combined with the sparse materials provided by the shoes, were identified by several students as affording a festival or rave look. For this reason, perhaps the most common outcomes were variations on corsets, bodices and harnesses, followed by bags and purses. Brooches and earrings were perceived as a way to use small pieces, as were belts comprised of multiple parts. It was the more unconventional outcomes, described here as wearables or wearable sculptures, that indicated a more material-driven approach, influenced less by conventional archetypal forms and more through experimentation with materials on the body. The questions arising here were: what enabled or prevented students from going beyond commonly or conventionally perceived affordances? In what ways might the learning design and assessment criteria have affected perception of unconventional affordances? And what can be learnt from students' own strategies and responses to the activity and criteria? So here I'm just going to go through a little bit of the data, and we'll start with this student, Sophie, who produced this outcome. She explained, I was kind of brainstorming what the sole would be useful for, and I decided it would probably be best for something off the body, as the base of a little bag, because it's like sturdy and quite bulky. So for the final one, I started with the base of the shoe, and then I got like some bigger pieces and just kind of glued them onto the bottom to make the base of the handbag. And I found that the super glue was working very well, because I was planning on like sewing the fabric pieces together, but the super glue was just really easy and quick and actually really strong. So I just kind of collaged all the pieces using the super glue around the shoe. And yeah, I just tried to make it roughly the shape of a bag. And then I didn't want to create any waste, so I used the shoelace as a strap here. And I threaded it through the original holes that the shoelaces were on in the shoe. So yeah, that's the final artefact. There it is on the body. So here, during analysis, it proved useful to sort of loosely divide students into three categories: those who exhibited or embraced a material-driven approach to making, those who continued to use traditional design-driven approaches, such as sketching or brainstorming, as Sophie explained here, pattern making, and the use of research for visual inspiration and design precedents, and those who sat somewhere in between, using a mixture of both. And these in-between students provided the best initial insights to the strengths and weaknesses of the activity design. And Sophie was sort of identified as being one of those in-between students of doing both, some of those traditional practices, but also kind of the material-driven, taking inspiration from the materials. So she clearly demonstrated in this example a perception of the affordances as sturdy, bulky rubber soles for use as the base of the bag, and her aim to use all the materials ensured an effective use of the laces as straps or holes or eyelets for connecting. In contrast, her approach to design through brainstorming and sketching, along with her efforts using glue to make the materials take the shape of a conventional bag, demonstrated a tendency to be guided by conventional accessory archetypes, precedents and practices. The outcome, however, was extremely effective and entirely legitimate in relation to established fashion design practices. Indeed, it was the kind of bag one might see from deconstructionists like Martin Margiela, or with respect to shoes more recently, Paolina Russo, a postmodern collage of materials bearing an almost humorous reference to the object's past life. The bag was, however, more the kind of upcycled artefact one might typically associate it with material reuse than a demonstration of a genuinely sustainable material-driven shift in design thinking. Indeed, this more postmodern approach to upcycling had meant that rather than deconstructing and remaking the shoes beyond all recognition, the identity of the components had been intentionally retained for novel effect. And she explained, "I could have taken apart the tongue and fully taken off the label, but then I would have just had really small pieces, and I kind of liked having the effect of the full tongue in the final artefact. Furthermore, part of the appeal of the bag was the recognisable sole, resulting in a familiar yet unfamiliar or uncanny effect." So in relation to this particular example, two key observations can be made. Firstly, the partial deconstruction and consequent references to the original shoe potentially denied the student the opportunity to move beyond its original function and meaning, to perceive, generate and utilise the material's more unconventional affordances. And the second issue to disadvantage the previous and other submissions was the use of virgin materials. In this case it was glue, but for many others it was materials such as staples, eyelets, press studs, jewellery findings and paint, which enabled them to stick safely to convention, control their materials and realise their preconceived ideas. Those who resisted the use of virgin materials were required to adapt by joining components in different ways that afforded the discovery of entirely new and often unexpected objects, forms and techniques. And here is another idea by Sophie, who demonstrated an alternative outcome requiring little or no glue, seeming to demonstrate a much more material-driven approach. So again, one of those students that was kind of demonstrating both kinds of approaches. So it was this process of discovery that provided a sense of enjoyment and motivated many students throughout the activity. However, there were barriers, and often rubber outer soles were usually left unused. Glavinot suggests that a cultural tendency to respect the integrity of an object, especially in the case of precious things, can prevent the perception and generation of unconventional affordances. And while many enjoyed the opportunity to overcome the integrity of the shoes, the outer soles were often just too hard to get past. A few students did, however, deconstruct them, going on to produce some quite innovative outcomes. We'll just have a quick look at those now. So one of these students articulated her process during the assignment presentations, explaining, I became more absorbed by the materiality of what I was touching and what else these materials could rather be than think about the actual end product and work backwards. To enable this to happen, she identified the need for an almost robotic approach to deconstruction where, she explained, you have to just really sort of mentally keep going like you're a breaker and that's it. She described that where previously she may have looked at the rubber outer sole and thought, oh, I can just cut it in half and turn it into bad looking coasters or something, as she deconstructed, she reflected, I could really start to see newer things that came into my mind, what I could actually make out of it rather than when it was left as one solid thing. Things that I probably would never have seen, like mentally, had I not cut things up into smaller components. Indeed, close attention to the outsole's construction and the pattern of the tread provided her with guidance about how they might be cut. Its removal from the midsole revealed a grid structure that afforded a cube-like division of smaller parts that, with the addition of a hole, were used like beads to make a bracelet or earrings. And aligning with this robotic approach, another student described a process where, as she described being sort of on autopilot, where she just kept cutting the soft rubber soles of her slippers in concentric circles, becoming increasingly intrigued by the shapes that appeared. She reflected, I think this abstraction process allowed me to make something that no longer had any connection to this original form. Throughout the deconstruction, both of these students took an almost mindful approach, consciously resisting a tendency to want to predict what the materials could be made into, instead letting the materials reveal themselves. And as Glavinot asserts, acts of discovery of unperceived affordances stand at the core of creative practice, and both of these students produced unique final outcomes. Other barriers to the perception and utilisation of unconventional affordances were the gross stickiness of the glue, often too inconvenient and abject to use, as were the dirty soles. In the interest of time, you can refer to the full paper for further details of the ways some students managed the abject nature of the materials. But in addition to the abject, another barrier was ugliness. And this was a real preoccupation for a lot of students. A general need to produce aesthetically pleasing outcomes manifested in various ways, for example, decorating and embellishing with things like paint, spray paint, beads, sequins and ribbons, while for others it was the ability to produce symmetrical, repetitive and refined forms. Philip, who produced a highly successful festival-ready collar from his shoes, became frustrated when using discarded electrical wires for the subsequent assignments. The wires wouldn't conform to his desired aesthetic due to their cumbersome plastic insulation, which would cause them to spring back into form. This prevented him from being able to achieve the neat, repetitive forms he had prototyped with more compliant embroidery thread. Here we see the agency again. He eventually found ways to work with the wires and his techniques became enhanced. The journey required to successfully collaborate with these materials resulted in a significant final sense of achievement for the student. So on reflection, we realise that the symmetry and repetition afforded by the matching shoes in the first This Is Not a Shoe task did little to challenge conventional perceptions of beauty, and some students leaned safely towards these qualities to achieve their desired outcomes. We reflected that the swapping and mismatching of shoes at the beginning could have been a more practical early strategy to overcome these norms and discover unconventional affordances. And in the current iteration of the course, which we're currently conducting, we did get students to swap shoes with highly successful results and a diverse range of outcomes. So much less of those bodice corset pieces. So on reflection, examples such as those above emphasise the value of more explicit assessment criteria that go beyond merely discouraging the use of virgin materials to banning them entirely. And this was highlighted later in the course when, due to further relaxation of these rules, even those who had done well with the shoes found it too easy to slip back into old habits, producing upcycled vinyl accessories stuck together with glue and tape. As explained in the outset of this paper, the use of glue is easy, A reliance on these materials early in the course and throughout the development of the material experiment set the students on an unsustainable trajectory that could not be undone. The aesthetics produced could rarely be replicated in more sustainable ways. And Philip, who resisted the use of virgin materials in later assignments, explained, "I think the outcomes would have been different, as I know I would have just bought more to achieve the outcomes that I wanted. It's not been until the end of this assignment that I've realised the value of the found or gifted supplies. When you're faced with limited supplies, you have to strategise your experiments, and working within constraints is a skill that I would like to continue to develop." On reflection, the requirement to use all the materials could also have been further emphasised through the assessment criteria. The effort and time required to use everything often resulted in a deeper respect and emotional attachment with the original artefact, its materials and the resulting outcomes. Often a sense of frustration with one's materials resulted in a kind of love-hate relationship. For example, Philip exclaimed in his folio, "Ultimately, in capitals, I had to accept the wires as they were and try something else." For these students, there was often a recognition that while the materials had tested them, the skills they acquired made it all worthwhile. Indeed, Ash commented that the hard work meant she didn't think she'd ever throw her accessories away. And here we're sort of starting to get into that emotionally durable design territory. The intentionality of the materials was also something many reflected upon, particularly when the materials weren't doing what they wanted. Ash also speculated that she felt the shoes were grateful to have been used, and she said, "It's almost like as if the shoes had some sort of life form or emotion. They were sort of thank you, because once you deconstruct it, you make it into something a bit more special." Although beyond the scope of this paper, the notion of material agency or even animism as a motivating factor in sustainable design practice certainly warrants further discussion. So in conclusion, and thank you very much for your patience in this slightly long presentation, I wanted to start the conclusion with this wonderful quote by Bharati and Khurana that explains designers settle for low-hanging material potentials if the conditions for discovering novel affordances do not present themselves. That this is not a shoe activity, and the adjustments proposed through analysis of its successes and shortcomings outline the conditions necessary within a pedagogical context to enhance a perception of unconventional affordances during the creative process. Shoes were discovered to be particularly useful for this activity due to their socio-cultural significance and complex and varied material composition, providing students with an often challenging but rewarding opportunity to unmake, defamiliarise and unlearn fashion, and to discover how fashion might be done differently or more sustainably. For some participants, a sense of respect and emotional attachment arose through the reciprocal interactions occurring between body, artefact and materials. And this was particularly true for those who pushed through the too hard barrier during reconstruction to use every part of their shoes and resist the use of conventional, often unsustainable virgin materials, invariably glue. In this respect, the application and enforcement of a more rigorous set of assessment criteria would have assisted all students to further develop these creative skills and values, and I will say that we have noticed that in the most recent iteration of this course, where we've implemented the findings of this research, and we've been absolutely astonished by the ways that the students have embraced the challenges of not using glue and using all of their materials. So while the activity was conducted in a fashion accessories context, it's proposed that the ubiquitous yet complex and underestimated shoe would prove equally successful in multiple other creative disciplines as an introductory activity to encourage early material understanding and an enhanced ability to perceive matter, identify unconventional affordances, and engender a more collaborative approach to making and design. Furthermore, a material-driven approach to the making of fashion raises epistemological questions around design, in inverted commas, as a concept based upon the use of materials to realise preconceived ideas. It's argued here that rethinking design traditions such as the use of sketching, mind mapping, visual inspiration, design precedents, and even the use of mannequins could help to overcome continued distinctions between bodies and materials and the desire for a mastery over rather than collaboration with environments. Aside from shoes, therefore, the research argues, ultimately, for the importance of activities involving upcycling or reuse for developing embodied and transferable material capabilities and knowledges. Thank you very much for your time. That's the end of the presentation, and we invite you to replicate the This Is Not a Shoe activity. And if you do so, please credit the authors and disseminate the outcomes using the social media hashtag This Is Not a Shoe. Thank you.